It's Friday, December the 2nd, and this is Politics UK. Welcome to your weekly roundup of parliamentary highlights. I'll be joined by correspondents in Edinburgh and Cardiff, and here in Westminster by our parliamentary correspondent Sean Curran. On the programme this week, diphtheria, a rare disease in the UK for nearly a century, breaks out at a migrant centre in Kent.
No asylum seeker will leave Manston if they're displaying any symptoms whatsoever of diphtheria or indeed other serious infectious diseases.
The Business Secretary gives the green light to the Sizewell C nuclear power station.
This is the first direct stake a government has taken in a nuclear project since 1987.
The Northern Ireland Secretary says it's unacceptable there's still no government at Stormont, but the DUP hits back.
I am not prepared to nominate ministers, Mr Deputy Speaker, to an executive where a unionist minister is required to implement a protocol that every day harms our place in the United Kingdom.
Avian flu threatens turkey supplies this Christmas in Scotland and around the UK.
We've killed birds on all the infected premises, and the total number is 224,000.
Well, Sean, let's talk about that story in the headlines. An outbreak of diphtheria here in the UK. How's this happened?
Yes, it's not something you would expect to hear. The UK started vaccinating children against diphtheria in the 1940s. And so as a result, this infectious disease, highly infectious disease, is almost unheard of in this country. But at the start of the week, the government confirmed that 50 people who had been in asylum accommodation had diphtheria. And this followed the death of a man who had been at that processing centre in Kent, Manston, and who had died. And ministers said he had tested positive for an infectious disease, and they were now waiting for the results of a post-mortem to see what the cause of death was. So this is obviously quite a serious thing, a very unusual incident, and the Immigration Minister, Robert Jenrick, came to the Commons to make a statement about the situation.
It's important to emphasise that the UK HSA has been clear that the risk to the wider UK population from onward transmission of diphtheria is very low, thanks in no small part to our excellent childhood immunisation programme, and because the infection is typically passed on through close, prolonged contact with a case. From today, no one presenting with symptoms will progress into the asylum accommodation system. They will either remain at Manston, isolating for a short period, or they will travel to a designated isolation centre in secure transport, where they will be treated until deemed medically fit.
By mid-October, the Home Office admitted publicly that there were cases at Manston, but on the 26th of October, the Home Office officials told the Select Committee they had sufficient health arrangements in place to address diphtheria. Clearly, they did not. The government still kept thousands of people in overcrowded conditions, described by one person as being huddled around fan heaters, thousands of people in overcrowded conditions trying to stay warm. Clearly, these are conditions which make it easy for infectious diseases to spread. The processes that he has just described now clearly are important, but why on earth were they not put in place many weeks ago?
Earlier this year, I informed the Home Office that some 30 Albanian asylum seekers had absconded from Thwaite Hall facility in my constituency. The then Minister for Immigration, the predecessor of the Minister of State, informed me in his reply that asylum seekers, and I quote, are not prevented from leaving or legally required to stay within its confines. He might as well have said, not my problem, Gov. Considering the reports there's been an outbreak of highly contagious and dangerous disease at the Manston processing facility, how can a minister square this laissez-faire approach to asylum seeker dispersal with any serious concern for public health?
Minister.
Well, it's for those reasons that I took the decision today that no asylum seeker will leave Manston if they're displaying any symptoms whatsoever of diphtheria or indeed other serious infectious diseases. They'll either remain there or, more likely, they'll be taken to one of our secure isolation hotels, the type of hotels that we used during the COVID pandemic. They'll remain there and will not leave whilst they're treated and hopefully make a full recovery, and then will be transported to other accommodation elsewhere in the country.
It's unlikely that I would ever call this country a villain on this matter. Actually, I think we've been too soft. I think we need to be much more robust. Does my right honourable friend agree with me that actually the source of tackling this problem is making these tens of thousands of journeys a year, illegal entry into our country, unviable? That deals with overcrowding, that deals with all of these issues.
This obviously should have come as no surprise to the government that these conditions would break out, because as the chair of the APPG on immigration detention, we found very similar circumstances at Napier Barracks, including cases of scabies outbreaks in that accommodation. So could you tell me in a bit more detail what exactly is being done to ensure that the widest possible screening is done, rather than send people off out into the world with conditions like scabies and no treatment? Because at Napier, people were forced to share cream between them and didn't have proper washing facilities for their clothes and their bedding.
There are thorough screening procedures, both immediately on arrival in Dover and then later on at Manston. There is an extensive medical facility at Manston where anyone presenting with symptoms of diphtheria or indeed any other condition can get access to medical care. That's designed both to ensure that they have good care, but also to put as little pressure on the local NHS in Kent as is possible. It's frequent that individuals do go to local GP surgeries or emergency department in hospitals, and we make sure that they have access to the NHS as any member of British society would do.
Robert Jenrick there. Sean, talking of topics of concern, let's turn to the global energy crisis. There have been important developments in the future of nuclear power in the UK this week. Tell us about them.
Yes, well, you've probably heard about Sizewell C, the new nuclear power plant in Suffolk. It's been in the pipeline for years, and every now and again a government will come along and will reconfirm its commitment to building the new nuclear power station. The Chancellor, Jeremy Hunt, just a few weeks ago in his budget said it was definitely going to go ahead. And then this week, Grant Shapps, the Business Secretary, announced more details. And basically what the government has done is it is spending hundreds of millions of pounds to take a stake in the project. So it will be a partner with the French energy firm EDF, which is building the power station. And they are effectively buying out a Chinese state company. So it's a big shift, and the Secretary of State came to the Commons to basically announce that this was a project that was definitely going ahead.
As I mentioned yesterday, I was in Suffolk, where, thanks to government investment, the development of Sizewell C nuclear plant has been given the green light. It will not only generate cleaner, cheaper, low-carbon electricity for the equivalent of 6 million homes, but also generate 10,000 jobs during construction and thousands more in the supply chain. And this is the first direct stake a government has taken in a nuclear project since 1987. And it's the first step on the ladder to a long-term energy independence.
Alongside nuclear, we need a sprint for cheap, clean, homegrown renewables. And I have to say to the Secretary of State, given the chaos, confusion and embarrassment of the government on onshore wind, I find it extraordinary they didn't come to the House today to clear it up. Let me remind the House of some facts. The ban on onshore wind in England that they put in place in 2015 has raised bills for every family in this country by £150 each. And keeping the ban in place up to 2030 would mean customers paying £16 billion more on bills compared to a target of doubling onshore wind. Let us be clear, opposing onshore wind waves the white flag on our energy security and raises bills for families.
These turbines are now so large they can't even be constructed onshore. They are so big the turbines wouldn't be able to be carried by road. They have to be put offshore. How big are they? Well, it's actually convenient. It's the World Cup's on. He'll be able to envisage this. They are these single turbines are 7 football pitches in scope as they turn. They're not buildable onshore, and it's one of the reasons why the cheapest way to build them offshore, to produce energy offshore, is to build these mammoth turbines which go together in groups of 2 or even up to 300.
I am frankly staggered that he can possibly think that Sizewell C is cheaper. Can I ask him cheaper than what? It is massively costly. The RAB funding model basically means that consumers end up paying twice, once towards the cost of construction to lower the cost of borrowing, and then for more costly energy as a result. He'll know that there's no nuclear power station in the world that's been built to time and to budget.
She asks about Sizewell C, and she asks cheaper than what? I'll tell her what it's cheaper than. It's cheaper than being subject to Putin's invasion on Ukraine. That's what it's cheaper than.
It took an international conflict to lessen and hopefully eliminate Europe's dependency on a potential enemy, Russia. Can the Minister confirm that we will have no future dependency on China for our nuclear power stations?
I can certainly confirm in the case of Sizewell C, as I mentioned earlier, that we were making sure that the Chinese element of that is no longer involved. We don't have a principled objection, apart from where issues of national security are concerned, and things like energy provisions clearly very much in our sights.
Grant Shapps there. Thank you. Sean, more from you later on. Let's go to Edinburgh and Holyrood and our Scotland political reporter, Jenny Davidson. Jenny, hello to you. There have been calls from the Scottish Conservatives to pause reform of the Gender Recognition Act after concerns were raised by the UN Special Rapporteur on Violence Against Women and Girls. What was the response from the First Minister?
Well, fair to say the First Minister didn't agree with that. Now, the background to this is that the UN Special Rapporteur on Violence Against Women and Girls, Reem Assalem, she's written to the UK Government this week to raise concerns about the bill that's going through the Scottish Parliament at the moment to reform the Gender Recognition Act. She's said that it poses potential risks to women and girls, and that she shares concerns that the proposals could open a door for violent men to abuse the process. She's also wanting it to be delayed while some court cases that are actually relevant to this legislation are allowed to finish and get the results of those. Now, Nicola Sturgeon said that she didn't think these concerns were well founded. She said other women's groups here in Scotland had taken a different view, and that ultimately this was going to be a question for Parliament to decide.
It's far better that this government and this Parliament makes good laws rather than quick laws. We want to make legislation with full and proper consideration of all of the implications. But for some reason, the government seems determined to rush ahead at full speed to put this bill through this month. The experts and women's groups say could have potentially damaging consequences. Now, the First Minister said the Special Rapporteur's criticisms are not well formed. Reem Assalem is a United Nations expert. She is a Special Rapporteur on violence against women and girls. I personally think very few people can speak with greater authority on women's safety. The Scottish Parliament, including the committee in charge of scrutinising this bill, has not had the chance to examine her evidence and hear from her in person, which the Cabinet Secretary will be doing. So will the First Minister agree today to pause this legislation so we can properly consider the findings of a leading global expert on this crucial matter?
Regardless of any individual's view on this legislation, one thing that cannot be said with any credibility or basis in fact is that it is being rushed through this Parliament. This process, through consultation, introduction of draft legislation, introduction of legislation, the formal parliamentary scrutiny process has been underway now, I think, for a period of 6 years. This has not been rushed. This has been done carefully and rightly so. It is the case already that registered sex offenders must by law notify the police of any change of name. That requirement applies to an individual irrespective of what name they use or what gender they identify with.
Well, the Cabinet Secretary for Equalities is going to meet with the UN Special Rapporteur about her concerns, and at the same time the bill is still proceeding through Parliament, lots of amendments being raised now at the committee stage, but no sign that it's likely to be paused.
Jenny, a report published this week showed a record number of deaths in Scottish prisons. What do we know about the causes of that?
Well, yes, this is a report that's come from the University of Glasgow that found record numbers of deaths of Scottish prisoners over the last 3 years, so 121 deaths since the beginning of 2020. Now, it points particularly to suicides and to drugs-related deaths, both of those on the rise and also higher proportionately than in prisons in England. Other causes as well, like COVID, like infectious diseases. And there's also some criticism in the report about fatal accident inquiries, the effectiveness of some of those and the time some of them are taking to be resolved. Now, the Scottish Government has accepted this is something it needs to look into, but the Scottish Conservatives were complaining that it had already promised to look into this, and we're not seeing results yet.
These figures are significantly worse in Scotland than they are in other parts of the UK. In Scotland, 15% of prison inmates have long-term mental health problems, 30% of them have alcohol use disorder, and 17% actually have a history of self-harm. Yet despite all these challenges, there continues to be huge variation in the provision of mental health nurses within the prison estate. For example, in HMP Barlinnie, it's just one nurse per 282 inmates. I raised this disturbing trend explicitly with the First Minister in October of this year. So, with these deaths in custody at this tragic new high, can I ask what further progress has been made on the First Minister's own pledge to improve conditions and reduce these needless and avoidable deaths?
Cabinet Secretary.
First of all, can I acknowledge the point that Jamie Green makes about the difference in Scotland to the rest of the UK? I think it's a relevant factor to look at. I think it is more complex than is sometimes suggested. But of course, we would point to the fact that whether it's through COVID deaths or the impact of COVID itself on the mental health of prisoners, there are particular things which have made this period more difficult. However, that's also true, of course, in England and Wales. So I acknowledge the fact there's a difference here which we have to interrogate. And for that reason, I think we have to take some time to look at all the elements of the report.
Now, the Scottish Prison Service has said it's working on suicide prevention, it's working to prevent drugs getting into prisons, and also it's pointed to an ageing prison population, which obviously is likely to lead to more people dying while in prison. Worth noting as well, there's slight differences in the way that the figures are recorded in Scotland and England, so not completely comparable. But the Scottish Government has acknowledged that there's something here that's an issue that needs to be looked into further.
Jenny, we heard in the headlines the effect of bird flu on turkey farms has been causing concern across the UK. There's been disagreement, though, about the response in Scotland, hasn't there?
That's right. Of course, it's been in all the news headlines this week recently. In the run-up to Christmas, obviously, concerns about shortages of turkeys. But the issue here in Scotland is about the slightly different approach to prevention. Now, it is less serious at the moment in Scotland. There's only been 8 outbreaks compared to 125 recorded in England. But the big difference is that in Scotland, there's no compulsory indoor housing of birds at the moment, whereas that's been put in place across the other 3 nations of the UK. The National Farmers Union, the NFU, wants that also put in place in Scotland too. But the Scottish Government experts disagree, and the Chief Veterinary Officer, Sheila Voss, was giving evidence to the Rural Affairs Committee this week.
We've killed birds on all the infected premises, and the total number is 224,000 across the whole of Scotland, as to round numbers. To put that into comparison, England have killed 1.673 million turkeys and 2.003 million chickens, plus ducks and geese.
And what is the percentage of the total flock in Scotland?
1%, 1.5%, thereabouts.
And in comparison to England, do you know?
They're about 2.5%, 3%.
I don't know if this applies like it did with COVID. Maybe we're behind the curve and it's coming up here. Or...
Yeah, we certainly could be behind the curve. And so we're continually monitoring what's happening so that if we need to take further measures, we can.
Yes, the Chief Veterinary Officer, Sheila Voss, was saying that other biosecurity measures are more effective than keeping birds indoors, and actually, in fact, that could cause the spread within these birds that are housed indoors. So that's a point of disagreement, but may yet come in Scotland. She said it was a kind of last resort, the last thing to do. But one point of difference one point of agreement, rather, between the Chief Veterinary Officer and the National Farmers Union is about eggs. Both are saying that's not to do with bird flu. Any shortages, they're actually to do with economic and pricing factors, not bird flu. So that's a different issue altogether.
Jenny Davidson, thank you very much there in Edinburgh at Holyrood. Back to Westminster now, and to you, Sean. Education dominated Prime Minister's questions this week. It was an interesting debate, or sparring, between Rishi Sunak and Keir Starmer. What was his line of questioning?
Yes, it was a different sort of Prime Minister's questions from the ones we've seen previously. Keir Starmer has faced criticism from some elements of the media and some Conservative supporters over his approach towards private schools and the tax advantages that they enjoy. He hadn't spoken about it before, but this week, at Prime Minister's questions, as well as trying to highlight tensions within the Tory ranks and issues that Rishi Sunak might have to face in the coming weeks, he was prepared to tackle this head on. And in fact, he opened with a criticism of the current situation and a jab at Rishi Sunak's old school.
Winchester College has a rowing club, a rifle club, an extensive art collection. They charge over £45,000 a year in fees. Why did he hand them nearly £6 million of taxpayers' money this year in what his Levelling Up Secretary calls egregious state support?
Prime Minister. Mr. Speaker, I'm pleased he wants to talk about schools, because we recently announced billions more funding for our schools. We're helping millions of the most disadvantaged children catch up with their lost learning. And we're driving up school standards, Mr. Speaker. But during COVID, he wanted to keep schools closed. We shouldn't be surprised, because I listen to parents and he listens to his union paymasters.
Mr. Speaker, his Levelling Up Secretary, I see him down there, who, after all, was Education Secretary for 4 years, said you could scarcely find a better way of ending burning injustices than scrapping these handouts. And here's why, and he talks about driving up standards. Just down the road in Southampton, and he'll know this, 4 in every 10 pupils fail their English or Maths GCSE this year. 4 in 10. Is that £6 million of taxpayers' money better spent on rifle ranges in Winchester or driving up standards in Southampton?
Prime Minister. Well, Mr. Speaker, he talks about school standards. It's under a Conservative government, and thanks to the reforms of the former Education Secretary, that now almost 90% of schools are good or outstanding. That's when we came on. But Mr. Speaker, whenever he attacks me about where I went to school, he is attacking the hard-working aspiration of millions of people in this country. He's attacking people like my parents, Mr. Speaker. This is a country that believes in opportunity, not resentment. He doesn't understand that, and that's why he's not fit to lead.
They are killing off aspiration in this country, and it's not just education. Why is the dream of home ownership far more remote now than it was when his party came into power 12 years ago?
Prime Minister. Well, Mr. Speaker, what have we done in those 12 years? The highest number of new homes started in 15 years. Largest number of first-time buyers in 20 years.
He talked about 10 years ago. What do we inherit? The lowest level of house building in a century.
I've heard he's having a relaunch. Apparently, it's called Operation Get Tough. So how tough is he going to get with his backbenchers who are blocking the new homes this country so badly needs?
Prime Minister! Mr. Speaker, we're delivering record numbers of new homes under this government. That's what we're doing. He talks about toughness, Mr. Speaker. He's too weak to stop dozens of his own MPs joining the picket lines. So what, if he wants to support those hard-working families and show some leadership, why doesn't he confirm right now that no Labour MPs are going to join those picket lines?
I can help him with this one. He doesn't need to do another grubby deal. If he wants to defeat that amendment from his anti-growth backbenchers on national targets for housing, Labour will lend him the votes to do so. Country before party, that's the Labour way. Why doesn't he try it?
Mr. Speaker, I think we did hear too weak to confirm no one on the picket line. But Mr. Speaker, it's the same old Labour ideas: more debt, more inflation, more strikes, and more migration. He tells his party what they want to hear. I'll take the difficult decisions for this country, and that's the choice, Mr. Speaker. It's the politics of yesterday with him or the future of the country with me.
Lively PMQ session this week. We also saw big public protests continuing in China for the first time since those protests at Tiananmen Square back 30 years ago. Sean, a BBC journalist was among those arrested. What happened?
Yes, this is an interesting situation in China. There was a fire in a high-rise block in western China last week, and 10 people died. And what we've seen as a consequence are growing numbers of anti-lockdown protests, people complaining and protesting against the COVID restrictions, some blaming the deaths on that situation. And our colleague, Ed Lawrence, was filming protests in Shanghai when he was arrested, and the BBC says he was kicked and beaten whilst he was arrested by officials. And so this week, there was a lot of concern. I mean, there's already a lot of concern, I think it's fair to say, at Westminster about the government's approach to China and what is going on with China. And we had an urgent question where a minister was forced to come to the House after the DUP's Jim Shannon was given the right to ask a question about this.
Currently, the reason given to the BBC by Chinese authorities was that they had arrested him for his own good in case he caught COVID from the crowd. Wow, what a pathetic answer. I mean, my goodness.
When the Chinese ambassador comes to the Foreign Office, FCDO, when called in, these points will be raised, particularly around this immediate point about the arrest and the unacceptable manner of the arrest and the justification, which, as he's highlighted, is incredibly thin. We will also raise the wider point that he's mentioned about the safety of journalists in that meeting as well.
There's an endless litany now of China's bad behaviour, and I simply raised this particular question with him. How is it yesterday the Prime Minister, who previously said that China posed a systemic threat, has now moved to a systemic challenge, and that our strongest policy statement now, in terms of our reputation and relationship with China, is that we are going to be robustly pragmatic? Could he please explain to me how robustly pragmatic will worry the Chinese any one bit?
Sadly, this is the approach we've come to expect and the tone that we've come to expect from an increasingly authoritarian Chinese regime. I do welcome the Foreign Secretary summoning the Chinese ambassador and the consular support provided to Mr. Lawrence. The robust response is a welcome change to the government's previous handling of Chinese overreach in Manchester, which this House felt did not match the severity of the violence outside the Chinese consulate.
I wonder what effect calling the ambassador in has, and whether more doesn't need to be done urgently that actually has an effect on the Chinese operation in the UK. Should we not be looking to expel diplomats to take tougher action in international forums where Chinese interests are at stake, to do things that the Chinese would not want us to do, like improving our relationship with Taiwan or inviting the Dalai Lama on a formal visit by the British government so that we show that we are not a pushover, we are not going to support the communist running dogs.
Last night, the Prime Minister said our relationship with China would be characterised by robust pragmatism. I have no idea what that means, and neither I expect do tech startups trying to decide about Chinese investment, universities looking at Chinese funding, journalists trying to decide how to cover Chinese stories, businesses looking at their supply chain and market strategies, and Chinese activists risking their lives. Isn't it time we had the long-promised China strategy and not just another hollow slogan?
We're going to be updating the integrated review to ensure that we continue to invest in our alliances and the capabilities that we need. We haven't committed to publish a separate China strategy, but we'll continue to maintain as much transparency as possible and keep Parliament updated on our approach to China.
Mr. Speaker, I spent much of my early career working as a presenter on BBC World Service TV News. Its correspondents and crews then, as now, put themselves at risk in order to tell the truth to the world, and we owe them all a debt of gratitude. Can my honourable friend assure the House that he will be extremely firm and robust in future conversations with China and indeed with other countries in insisting that protecting journalists' right to report freely is absolutely non-negotiable?
No, he makes a point with real conviction and with real experience. We're grateful for his work, and we do owe a debt of gratitude to the reporters that do invaluable work, and he can be assured of that, and we will make that point today with the Chinese ambassador.
Thank you, Sean. We'll be back to you later on. Let's go to Cardiff now and talk to our Wales political reporter, Tulare Glyn-Jones. Hello, Tulare. I gather there's been a call for an inquiry into how the COVID pandemic was handled in Wales.
Yes, this is a topic that comes up time and time again here, especially by the Welsh Conservatives. And this week it was a motion that said, in the absence of a Wales-wide COVID inquiry, that a committee should be set up here in the Welsh Parliament, known as what's called a special purpose committee, that said it would look into the areas not covered by the UK-wide COVID inquiry. And it received backing from across the opposition parties, but the resistance continued from the Labour backbenchers.
A month into the lockdown, the First Minister said, we will do the right thing for Wales at the right time. That is right for Wales. And we won't be doing that by looking over our shoulders at what others are doing. The Welsh Government has made its own decisions, and at times very different decisions, and it's entitled, of course, to do that. But I would hope the First Minister would accept there should be scrutiny and accountability for those decisions that were made.
If the UK inquiry cannot possibly cover all issues, let us do the gap analysis, if you like, identify what isn't being given the scrutiny it needs, and then focus on seeking answers around those issues. What possible objection could government and Labour members have to that?
By having a UK-wide inquiry, it will be more rounded. The UK government will have the powers and resources to be able to mobilise all the necessary information. I only have 3 minutes, and powers needed to interrogate it.
For many of those families who are still living with the loss and the pain, this is still really there. Now, I'm not saying this proposal or an inquiry in London will actually get rid of that, because it won't. But it will, and we know and we've heard, it will help people to move on slightly.
Now, previously, the First Minister, Mark Drakeford, has batted away these calls outright. But this week, there was some acknowledgement from the First Minister that there may be some scope in future to revisit these proposals. But that really frustrated the Leader of the Opposition.
If that concern materialises, then the motion's central proposal, a special purpose committee, is one that the government can and will support.
My issue with the offer that the First Minister made was that he doesn't want to see that committee start its work until the UK inquiry has completed all its streams of work. That is some considerable time in the future, and I believe that this Parliament that sits here today, which has corporate memory of those decisions and the ramifications of those decisions, needs to be able to undertake its parliamentary work.
Andrew R.T. Davis speaking there. He went on to implore Labour backbenchers to support his motion, but he was unsuccessful, and it ended up in a tie, 27 votes to 27, which meant that Elin Jones, the presiding officer of Plaid Cymru, was duty-bound to vote against.
Teleri, how did the Senedd react to the ruling of the Supreme Court that the Scottish Government was not allowed to call an independence referendum without UK government consent?
Well, this came up at First Minister's Questions on Tuesday, a few hours before the kick-off of the Wales versus England game in the World Cup. The less said about that, the better, of course. But Adam Price, the leader of Plaid Cymru, said that the two countries would be meeting on the pitch as independent football nations. But constitutionally, that wasn't the case.
You've said previously that the United Kingdom should now be seen as a voluntary association of nations. Do you agree with your counterpart in Scotland that last week's judgment means the United Kingdom is not currently, at least, a voluntary partnership when Westminster not just possesses a legal veto on self-determination, but is also politically determined, it seems, to using it? The Council General said last week that the best means of ensuring positive constitutional change will be the election of a Labour government. Should that government, in your view, commit to creating a clear and guaranteed route for a constituent nation of the UK to hold an independence referendum where there is an explicit mandate in its favour?
The position of the Welsh Government remains that set out in reforming our union. It's been our position for a number of years, and colleagues here will remember that what we said in that document was that provided a government has secured an explicit electoral mandate for the holding of a referendum and enjoys continuing support from its Parliament to do so, it is entitled to expect that the UK Parliament will take whatever action is necessary to ensure that the appropriate arrangements can be made.
So perhaps that doesn't move the debate on a great deal here. Mark Drakeford has said much of that before, but it's interesting all the same to hear what a so-called unionist First Minister here in Wales thinks on events in Scotland, and particularly interesting in light of what we're expecting to be the Gordon Brown report into the Constitution in the coming few days.
Teleri, thank you for bringing us up to date with everything that's happened this week in Cardiff. Back to events at Westminster now, Sean, and the quizzing of the Governor of the Bank of England by a previous Governor of the Bank of England. Sean, after all the turbulent times that we've had recently, I'm sure there was plenty to talk about.
Yes. Now, Andrew Bailey, the Governor of the Bank of England, is no stranger to parliamentary inquiries and committees. He often gives evidence to the MPs on the Treasury Committee. But this week, he was giving evidence to a Lords Committee. And, of course, you never quite know who's going to be on these committees. And, of course, one of the members of this particular committee is Mervyn King, Lord King, as he is now, somebody who used to do Andrew Bailey's job. So that sets up a rather intriguing cross-examination. And what we got from this was a bit of a behind-the-scenes glimpse into what was happening a few weeks ago, just before Kwasi Kwarteng delivered what we all now call his mini-budget that had such dramatic political and financial consequences. Now, they're talking in this exchange about the MPC, which is the Monetary Policy Committee of the Bank of England, and that's the body that sets interest rates. And, of course, they had set interest rates just a few days before that big announcement from Kwasi Kwarteng. And so we were getting some of the background to what the bank knew and when it knew it.
The MPC met on the Thursday, the day before the mini-budget. The convention, very clear convention, would have been that a Treasury official was present at that meeting.
Oh, they were?
And would have briefed the MPC not on individual tax measures, but on the overall scale of changes in the balance between taxes and spending. Was there a Treasury official meeting at that meeting?
Yes, there was, yes.
And did that official brief the MPC on the broad scale of the measures?
Well, I don't think Treasury officials were clear what was going to be in it at that point. I mean, I think that has to be clear. And this is, I think, supported by commentary from the then Chancellor and the then Prime Minister.
Even a day before that,
I don't think
Treasury
it was
officials did not know what was going to be.
No, I don't think it was settled at that time.
With a change of that magnitude, it certainly would have been normal for a Treasury official to tell the MPC, hey, something quite big is going to be announced tomorrow. I can't tell you perhaps a precise number, but it's going to be big. And it would have been very unusual for the Treasury official to come back the next month and say, I'm very sorry, I forgot to tell you last month.
I mean, I must be clear. The Treasury official, I think, told us what they understood to be the situation.
What was the biggest surprise to you? The actual announcements in the mini-budget or the market response to those announcements?
I think it was not only the absence of the OBR, but it was the sort of positive, we don't want the OBR involved message that came across. And, many people gave to me the sort of the flying blind analogy.
I wonder how difficult that was, that exchange there for Andrew Bailey. Finally, let's talk about Northern Ireland, Sean, where there's continued frustration at the lack of a functioning government. What is the situation?
So basically, the power-sharing arrangements have not resumed following elections earlier in the year. The DUP is basically saying that it won't allow the institutions in Northern Ireland to resume because of their unhappiness over the Northern Ireland Protocol. These are the post-Brexit trading arrangements for Northern Ireland. And so we've been in this stalemate for some time. It has consequences for politicians here at Westminster because the Northern Ireland Secretary has certain responsibilities, and the deadline has passed for when he has to make a decision about calling new elections in Northern Ireland. This week, he brought forward new proposals, in effect, new laws, to be pushed through Parliament very quickly, and that would allow him to postpone those elections further, and also, as a sort of an incentive to members of the Assembly in Northern Ireland, he intends to cut their pay if they don't meet. So this was a kind of rushed debate. It didn't stretch over days and weeks like normal policy debates do. It was all done in one day, and not quite emergency legislation, but certainly something that was being done at pace.
3 weeks ago, I stood at this dispatch box setting out my profound regret that the Northern Ireland Executive had not been restored by the legal deadline of the 28th of October. As I said then, I believe strongly that the people of Northern Ireland deserve a functioning Assembly and Executive, where locally elected representatives can address issues that matter most to those who elect them.
I am not prepared to nominate ministers, Mr Deputy Speaker, to an executive where a unionist minister is required to implement a protocol that every day harms our place in the United Kingdom.
I think people in the debate about restoring these institutions are frustrated that the idea that the party beside me are the victims in all this, when the people I represent and the member for Foyle represents and the member for North Down and many others were the people who have been Brexited against our will. Are we tearing everything down? Are we punishing the health service? No, we are turning up for work every day to try and find solutions.
That brings us to the end of this programme. Thank you very much, Sean. That's all for Politics UK for this week. I'll be back with Politics Live on Monday at 12:15 on BBC Two and the iPlayer. Bye-bye.